Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, your KidLit loving host, inviting you back for another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. This week, I'm talking with Jessica Vitalis. Jessica is a favorite middle grade author of mine, and she has been on the podcast before to talk about her middle grade novel, Coyote Queen. In that episode, all the way back in episode 8, we talked about the power of middle grade books, the appeal of a bit of magic, and how books can help us learn life lessons. She's here today to talk about her newest release, The Unsinkable Cayenne, a historical novel in verse about belonging, family, social class, and so much more. It will be hard to top how much I enjoyed our first conversation together, but I have a feeling this one will be just as good. So let's get right to it. Jessica, welcome back to the
Thank
Kids
you
That
so
Love
much, Stephanie. I'm so happy to be here.
It's so nice to be able to say welcome back instead of just welcome. I loved our first conversation, and I can't wait to dig into this newest book with you.
Fantastic. I am looking forward to it as well.
So I know you have been on the podcast before, and you have told a little bit of your backstory to listeners. But for those that haven't listened to that episode or who are newer to your work, I'd love if you take a minute or two and just tell us a little bit about your story, how you got to children's literature, and hopefully name drop some of those previous books that we're not talking about today, but are worth mentioning.
Absolutely. So I have been writing for about 20 years now, but the truth is that I have always been a reader and a writer. I had a very transient childhood, so I moved a lot. I think we talked about that in the last episode. And one of the things that I did, because I was moving so much, is I did a lot of reading and writing. But it really wasn't until well into adulthood that I decided to pursue a career in publishing. And at that point, it took me 13 years to get my first book deal. So it has been a really long journey. But as we were just talking about before the show started, I have now published 4 books in 4 years. So I feel like all of that hard work that I put in teaching myself to write, learning to write has paid off. My first 2 books, The Wolf's Curse and The Rabbit's Gift, were fantasy books. And then I switched directions a little bit. And my last book, Coyote Queen, that we already talked about, is based on my childhood. And I'm so, so excited to introduce Unsinkable Cayenne to an audience. This is another story that's different from Coyote Queen, but still very much inspired by my childhood.
Mm, and it's so good.
Thank you.
It is so good. As I, quickly mentioned, it's considered a historical novel in verse.
That
And I
will come as quite a shock, I have to say to some of your listeners, because it is set in 1985.
I'm so glad you said that. I thought, "Oh my gosh, this is considered a historical novel? My
Yeah.
childhood is considered a historical novel?"
I mean, it's horrifying for those of us who lived through that, but to modern readers, that happened well before they were born, so it's absolutely historical to them.
Yes. Yeah, that I did have a moment of pause when I realized that. I would love for you to give listeners a little sneak peek into The Unsinkable Cayenne. No spoilers, of course, you know that rule, but tell us a little bit about the book in your words.
Sure. Unsinkable Cayenne is about a young girl who has spent her life living with her hippie parents. They have crisscrossed the country in this embarrassing sticker covered van. And when they welcome twins to the family, they decide that they finally need to settle down. So Cayenne thinks that this is going to be a chance to finally live a normal life. But it turns out that fitting in isn't quite as easy as it sounds. And so she struggles. She struggles because they live in a very rundown house. Her parents, even though they've settled down, her parents are still kind of weird. They're hippies. They use weird herbs for deodorant. They won't let her wear makeup. She wears hand sewn clothing to school. And so she is really struggling. One of my favorite things about the story is that this story is set in 1985, as we just discussed. And the reason it's set in 1985 is because that was the discovery of the Titanic wreckage. And so Cayenne's teacher is absolutely obsessed with the Titanic. And she starts to learn a lot about the social strata on board the ship, about the people's lives on board the ship. And it sort of confirms what she already believes about herself, which is that she's not worthy of the rich kid's attention. She's not worthy of this boy that she has a crush on, of his attention. And so this book is really a journey about how socioeconomics impact the middle school experience.
I really loved that parallel storyline, if that's what I could call it, learning about Cayenne and her life, what's going on with her, what she thinks about herself, how she thinks about herself in relation to her new situation, while making those parallel connections to the Titanic. I loved that dynamic that happened between that. I am also an obsessed Titanic person. Not just, Kate Winslet style, but like the actual Titanic. So I really loved how you were making the connections between the here and now, meaning in 1985,
Mhm.
and the Titanic, and not just the actual pieces of it or the discovery of it, but as you mentioned, those bigger issues around it, like who survived and who didn't, and who had access to help and who didn't. Where did that come from? Is that an interest, or has that been an interest for you? I'd love to know where that pairing and how it came to be.
So the first time I mentioned the idea for this book to my editor, the first thing she said was, "Well, if you're gonna set it in 1985, you have to have a historical anchor," which is conventional wisdom, right? We all know that you can't just put a book in the past because you want to. Kids don't care about my childhood in 1985. I had to find some reason to set the story there. So I sat down, even before I started writing the story, I sat down and I started Googling 1985 because I was 10 then. I don't remember a lot of historical events. My family didn't have televisions. We didn't read newspapers. I was really completely cut off from the world. And the very first thing that came up in my search was that the Titanic wreckage was discovered. And like you, I think like most people, we all are just a little bit obsessed with the Titanic. And just immediately it clicked for me. And I started thinking about the scene where the third class passengers are locked below deck, which, by the way, is one of the only falsehoods about that movie that actually did not happen. The first class passengers, or excuse me, the third class passengers were locked below deck, but not intentionally. Those doors were always locked to prevent third class passengers from going to the first class. And when the ship started sinking, the order to unlock those doors just came way too late for the passengers to be able to escape. But I was thinking about those dynamics between the first class, the third class, which is really the heart of the Titanic movie, right? Even though it's a love story, it's very much about class. And I knew immediately that that was the kind of discussion that I wanted to have about Cayenne and her own life. So it just seemed like an absolutely natural fit.
It was. It was. It brought both of them to life in a different way, and the connections between the two of them just that much more powerful, I think. But I also think the power in this book comes from the way that you wrote it. This book is in verse. It's in beautiful, lyrical, emotional verse. Tell me about that. Why verse for this book, and how was that different for you in pulling it all together?
So that's a really interesting story. This book came about during COVID. And I was on the phone with a couple of my very dear writing pals, and we started tossing around the idea, believe it or not, of writing an anthology about first kisses. Now, I don't actually remember my first kiss. I know that sounds weird, but I just have no memory of it. So I started thinking back to my childhood and making a list of sort of places that might have been my first kiss or circumstances. And I ended up coming up with this moment where I was out walking my dog, George, who looks exactly like the George on the cover of the book, by the way. And I came across this really beautiful boy that I had never seen before. And I was building up my courage to say hi to him because I was a very shy kid. I didn't have the right clothes. I didn't like to draw attention to myself. And my dog, squatted down and took a giant poop
Happened.
right in front of the boy. And this was back in the day where we didn't take care of our dog's waste. We pretended it didn't happen. It was highly embarrassing. I was completely humiliated. So I tucked my head down and hurried on. This boy hurried on. We ended up in class together, but we were both so shy and embarrassed. I think we had crushes on each other, but nothing ever came of it. So I decided that I was going to write a story about what if I had built up the courage to say hi to this boy? What if this had been my first kiss? And so we sent this anthology out, and my editor was one of the people who read it. And she said, well, we don't do anthologies, but I love your story. If you want to turn it into a novel, I would love to buy it, or I would love to at least consider buying it. So I thought, that's too good of an opportunity to pass up. But here's the weird thing: when I sat down and wrote that story about the first kiss, it came out in verse. And I have never considered myself a poet, even though back in high school I wrote poetry. I had stopped doing that. When I got to college and we started to really analyze poems, it all just seemed too intellectual to me. And I thought, I'm not a poet. This isn't for me. So it was an absolute stunner for me when this book came out as verse. And then because my editor liked it, I was like, well, okay, maybe I can do poetry. So I decided just to run with it and give it a shot. And actually, in retrospect, I don't think there is any way that I could have written this story in prose. I just think the Titanic aspects and the way I weave it in and out of the story would have been very clunky and very cumbersome writing it in prose. So it turned out to be exactly the perfect format for the story I wanted to tell.
There really is such beauty in verse like this. I think it's a combination of the way the language sounds. I think it's also that white space that just allows the reader to jump in a little bit and play with it and really feel it. And I did. I sat there having read your previous books. I thought, what would this have looked like if it were in prose? And I thought, I don't want to know.
Yeah.
It's just it did. It flowed so beautifully and was so emotional. I said before we started recording that I didn't know if I would love a character like I loved Bud from Coyote Queen, but I did. Cayenne is sitting there in my heart right next to her, having a little conversation. And I know that verse was part of how, as a reader, I kind of took up those characters in my mind.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the beauty of verse, my friend Megan E. Freeman, who wrote Alone, talks about how verse evokes emotion. So we're not so concerned with telling people things as we are sort of showing them what's happening and let them just sit with those emotions, and all the white space on the page just really creates space for that. So thank you for
Oh,
saying that.
oh, you are welcome. And we've mentioned characters. So far we've talked about Cayenne, but there are other characters here that are residing inside my reading heart too. I've got to say there's Dawn, right, who is
Mhm.
this kind of march to your own drum, literally and figuratively, happily, right? And
Mhm.
I loved that she thought, this is something I totally would have done if I was allowed to do this as a kid, which is go to school dressed as what my favorite book characters would look like. I thought, you go, Dawn. I want to be Dawn. So you've got Dawn. You also have Bo, who,
Mhm.
is now, I know, created from your own childhood of having witnessed that giant doggy disaster, but who's also new, but
Mhm.
new for a very different reason. So again, no spoilers, but just as Cayenne has been moving around, Bo has been moving around for very different reasons, has his own story. And so I think while we've been talking a lot about Cayenne, those supporting character stories are so there and so present and so real that readers are going to find something for themselves, of themselves, opening their eyes to something else. And I haven't even mentioned some of the other girls because I
Mhm.
like Dawn and Bo the best. But talk to me about those characters, of how you ended up with such a beautiful, complete cast of characters, all going through their own things, but they're still woven together in each other's story, which is just beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. I really wanted to try to wrap my hands around the entirety of the middle school experience. So we do have Cayenne, who comes from this weird, poor hippie family. And of course, she's the main character in the story, but there are all sorts of other experiences in middle school. So Beau represents the very wealthy, rich family who seems to have it all. He's very popular. We have Don, who is also very, very well off. And in some sense, I kind of wanted to get at this idea that that's what allows her to be so quirky, because she's not being bullied. She's not being ostracized. She's just allowed to be who she is. And in part, it is her family's wealth that gives her that privilege. So I was playing with all of that as I was developing the characters. And then, of course, we have Tiff, who you did not mention. I'm sure she is not the most beloved character in the book, but she is also representing a fairly typical middle school experience where she sees these popular girls. She wants to be part of that crowd, and she's willing to kind of step on whoever she needs to in order to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't mention her, did I?
I thought that might be on purpose.
No, and I still liked them all, but yeah, some got closer to my heart than others, probably because of my own middle school experience and growing up. Those characters that
Absolutely.
we relate to and
Absolutely.
don't relate to. So in the last time we recorded, we talked about how important middle grade books were for so many reasons, but one of them being this idea that there are really big life lessons that can come out of these books that can help middle grade readers and adult readers during a particular phase of their life. And I was hoping you'd let me read a quote, because this book has just as many life lessons, I think, as the last time we talked about it. And there were a couple of quotes, but may I read a small little snippet that really gets at an important lesson for
Yep.
me?
Please do.
Okay, so this, and again, no spoilers, so I'm not going to say exactly what happens, but this particular page, if you will, it's not a line, but a particular page, comes a little towards the end, and it says, "This town, this move taught me to break down walls, take up space, claim my place in a world where there are always going to be people trying to make me feel small." That was an instant highlight for me. It was an instant sticky note flag. It's written in my quote notebook. It's on a sticky note over in this space that no one can see. It was such a it was such an important one for me because, like you, and we've talked about this, I moved a lot when I was
Mhm.
young. I think there were maybe 12 moves, by the time I got to middle school. And having Cayenne look at one of those moves, because she's moved around a lot, as an opportunity to learn about herself and to
Mhm.
feel better about herself in a process where she just wanted to stay put and feel grounded and feel rooted. And maybe the physical location doesn't have to determine that. Oh,
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
is a big one.
I'm really glad that you read that particular poem. I think that really summarizes the heart of the book. And one of the things that I love that we haven't talked about yet is one of the lines was something about breaking down walls. And that's a big theme in the book as well, because a lot of times when we feel very insecure, we feel not worthy, we put up walls around ourselves. And I think that's so easy to do in middle school, where you put up walls, not just in middle school, actually, all the way through life. We all put up walls to keep people away, to keep ourselves safe so they can't hurt us. But I have certainly experienced in my life, and science actually has proven that the more we can learn to sort of let those walls down and open ourselves up to real relationships and community, the healthier and happier we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I just stumbled upon that research too, that, the people who say at the end of their life what makes them happy, it's those meaningful connections and
Yep,
those
that's
meaningful
right.
relationships above anything else. Which brings me to one more quote that I wanted to share. Again, it's not a spoiler, but boy, is it an important piece that spoke to me. And it's this one. The one thing I know for sure is that my family will face the future together, even if we are squished in our little home on wheels. And we've mentioned a lot of themes in the book. There's Titanic, there's belonging, there's social class, there's friendship in middle school, but family and what it may or may not look like and what someone thinks it should or should not look like is such a beautiful theme in this book as well.
Thank you. That came about somewhat haphazardly as well. The very first time I sat down and wrote this story out, Cayenne had a family much more like Fudd's family in Coyote Queen. There was some domestic violence, there was some abuse happening, and I sent it off to my critique partners and they loved it. But one of them commented, this feels an awful lot like Coyote Queen. And I realized that I was kind of done exploring that. I had said what I needed to say with Coyote Queen, and I didn't really want to write another story that centered on that. So I played with the idea of, well, what happens if her family is actually loving? I wouldn't say functional, they're not completely functional, but there is no abuse happening, and they're all doing their best in their own sort of way. And so I think that really resonates to a lot of middle school kids, because I don't know any middle school kids who think their family is wonderful, right? That's
Right.
part of the growing up, coming of age experience, is feeling embarrassed by your family, and then eventually coming to terms with the parts of your family that you love. That doesn't mean that you love everything about them, but it's all part of that journey. And so I tried to pack all of that into Cayenne's story.
And you did. You did. And that this is a perfect time to mention the author's note at the end. The author's note has a little bit about Titanic, a little bit about you. It's got a couple of points, and so I'm hoping you'll just share a little bit with readers. Why did you decide to include that author's note, and what are you hoping readers will just take away from your book in general? Comes out in a couple of days, so it's perfect timing. So I'd love for us to end with a couple of thoughts around that.
Sure. So originally, the author's note just had the Titanic facts. Because I was writing in verse, there were some things that I wanted to communicate to readers just to clarify for historical accuracy, that didn't necessarily come through in the story because I was writing in verse. And then I had the short paragraph about how the story was inspired by my own life. I actually added, I think it turned out to be the very last paragraph to the author's note, about Cayenne's father and about the marijuana smoking, based on some early feedback from teachers and educators. Because in this story, Cayenne's father does smoke marijuana. He is a Vietnam vet. He is self medicating. He's suffering from PTSD. And readers were frustrated that at the end of the story, he's still kind of doing the same thing. And so I needed to let readers know that it's not my job as a middle grade author, and it should never, ever be the job of a middle grade kid to heal their families. So I tried to write a story that was authentic to my childhood experience, but also authentic to what children are experiencing now, because a lot of adults and caregivers smoke marijuana. So I tried to be really careful as I was writing the story not to glorify it. It's very clear that Cayenne does not like this. She's deeply embarrassed by it. But at the same time, I don't think it serves our young readers to just whitewash reality and remove anything that is slightly uncomfortable for adults. So I wanted to address all of that in the author's note.
Wow, that was really powerful. That section you just said, it's not the responsibility of a middle grade author, and it's not the responsibility of a middle grade reader to have that burden on their shoulders to fix things and have things turn out a certain way. And I would think that I imagine, yes, there were people that were concerned were probably the adults, the caregivers, but for the kids are quite, what's the word I want? They know that things aren't perfect, and they know that there are things in families that don't get resolved at the end of real life that might not get resolved in the end of a middle grade novel. Um, and that's part of why I really liked this as well, because it's not that it wasn't a happy ending, so to speak, where, oh, I don't want to give spoilers, but everything is perfect and, and in all the ways. And that's not real.
No, and
Isn't
that's so important to me as an author to write stories that are authentic because very often children don't have happy ever afters until they reach adulthood. So the hallmark of middle grade stories is that they have to end with hope, but hope is a different thing than happiness.
Oh boy, isn't that a life lesson right there, Jessica?
I'm sounding very smart today. I'm rather impressed with myself.
Sounding wonderful, wonderful. And I know listeners are thinking, okay, yeah, that just did it. I'm going to get my hands on this one. And just like, most all books, I would say this is a book that was written for middle grade readers, but it is a book for adults and for anyone really who has that inner child, for anyone who just wants to feel a little less alone, even if their situations are different. There's a kindred spiritness, I think, to Cayenne and her situation that comes through in that verse and in that white space. It's just beautiful. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
You are so welcome. Where can listeners find you online so that they can get their hands on the book when it comes out in a couple of days, or just follow you in your journey?
My website is jessicavitalis.com. I am active on Instagram, and my handle there is Jessica V Author. Same handle on Facebook, Jessica V Author. I very occasionally dip my toes into Twitter/X, although very, very rarely. So that's not a great place to find me these days.
Okay. Well, I'll put links to all of them, the website, all of the social media handles, and certainly a link to the Unsinkable Cayenne so they could easily click on it, as well as the previous ones where I got to put fun in there too. So Coyote Queen, I'll link to all of them in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming back. I think we did top our first conversation. This was just as wonderful. So thank you for spending time with us again.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.